I wrote a series of articles about organ donation for the Sunday Times. At the time, it was understood people were being encouraged to donate their organs. They were told that they would be dead when those organs were taken from them. But some doctors drew our attention to the fact that these donors were not dead. The concept of brain death was brought in, and then the equating of brain death with being dead, so that then allowed the surgeons to start operating on you while you were actually still alive. They did some stress tests, physiological measures, as the scalpel went in to start the dissection process. And lo and behold, they found that in many of these patients, the signals were of huge alarm. Blood pressure would shoot up, heart rate would speed up, all the signs of deep distress.
Neville Hodgkinson adds that in the wake of these reports, doctors decided to anesthetize donors to prevent the possibility of distress. To avoid unnecessary complications, we should prepare both donor and receiver based on a broader insight into consciousness and the way it is attached to our material life. The personal level of consciousness of both donor and receiver can influence whether an organ transplant is successful. If a donor is very attached to physical aspects, he might have trouble releasing these after the donation. Such a situation can pose a serious impediment for the donor in the usual process of dying and their journey to the afterlife. But it will also affect the receiver of the organ.
Some donor recipients, some organ recipients, have experienced a change of character after receiving their donor heart or lung or liver. And yes, it makes some sense that could be the case, that an organ would not only be a physical pump or whatever, chemical processor, but that something of the consciousness of the previous owner might carry over with it.
And I personally believe that each cell, each living cell in your body has a connection with consciousness. It's not only your brain, it's also your heart, but each cell has a connection. So when 96% of your body is still functioning, is still living, there's still a connection between all those cells and consciousness.
Colonel John Alexander had a remarkable experience showing that our body cells remain connected to our personal consciousness even when located some distance from ourselves. Saliva from his mouth was examined under a microscope 100 meters away from him when he had to address an important meeting.
And I stood up and I started describing the experiment, and the lab assistant comes running in and says, "What happened about a minute and a half ago?" He says, "Why?" He says, "Well, the needle just went crazy over there." And so what you saw was for hours, this little needle was just going blah, 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 blah. And then it got to this point, and it is hitting the stopper. It's just a huge electrical signal. Now, telling the National Research Council that the universe is not built the way they think it is an emotionally stimulating situation for me. And so it was my cells that it was monitoring. They saw this. Interestingly, when you get to the report, there's not a word. It's like the incident didn't even happen. So I say the white crow flew right in front of them, and they chose to ignore it.
Dear Pixie, is it true that when on receiving an organ transplant from a donor, the recipient can sometimes take on personality traits of the donor? This is correct in some cases, not all. The reason for this is the energetic signature of the individual that is the donor is still within the organ when it is transplanted into the recipient. Some individuals do not feel this consciously, and the new organ's signature merges with that of the recipient. In certain cases, the original donor's signature is felt by the recipient.
A heart transplant is now a routine operation. But a number of patients who have received new hearts are reporting huge changes in their tastes, personality, and most extraordinarily, in their memories.
Basically, from a surgeon's point of view, the heart is first and foremost, and perhaps last also, a pump.
So is our heart just an organ to pump blood, or could it be much more? The first patient to report a change in personality was Claire Sylvia, from Boston in the United States. 20 years ago, she was the first person at New Haven Hospital to receive a heart and lung transplant. The operation was a success.
It was very weird to see my heart on the machine, giving me the beat and hearing it. It was a whole new rhythm, a whole new feeling, and little did I know that my journey was just beginning. It was a couple of days after the surgery that the press came in to interview me, and one of the reporters asked, "Now that you've had this miracle, what do you want more than anything in the world?" And I said, "I'd die for a beer right now." It just came from me, and I'm not a beer drinker, and I was a little mortified by my flippant answer to such a profound question. So that was my first happening, and little by little many things started happening till I was really feeling convinced that I was living with the presence of another within me. The first thing that happened were the food preference changes. Suddenly, like green peppers, finding them, putting them in my food, I used to take them out. And the first time they allowed me to drive, I found myself going to a Kentucky Fried Chicken place to buy chicken nuggets, something I never did before. I found that my handwriting, instead of going from right to left, it was going from left to right. And these things were sneaking up on me, little by little.
Like most heart transplant recipients, no detail was revealed to Claire about her donor. All she was told was that her heart had come from a young man who had died in a motorcycle accident.
It wasn't until a few months after the transplant that I had a dream in which I'm with a young man. I awakened from the dream feeling that this for certain was my donor. And in the dream, his name, I knew him as Tim L. So I called the transplant coordinator, told her about the dream, and asked her if that was his name.
Remarkably, the donor's name was Tim Lamarand. What's more, he loved beer and green peppers. Chicken nuggets were found in his motorcycle jacket when he died. It was only when she finally met her donor family that she pieced everything together, giving her confirmation that everything she was experiencing had extraordinary similarities to her donor.
The family of my heart verified all the experience I was having, and they were hungry to get anything they could from me about Tim that I was remembering from his memories that were coming through me.
With strict codes of confidentiality in place at the hospital, it was impossible for Claire to have known these details about her donor. So where could these memories have come from? Professor Paul Pearsall is a cardioneurologist from the University of Honolulu. He first encountered stories like Claire's whilst recovering in hospital from a bone marrow transplant.
I had a bone marrow transplant for stage 4 cancer in the very early 80s. And I was on the transplant unit. And we would sit down at night, all of us who were dying, and most of us were, and talk about things. And the heart transplant recipients were reporting receiving the memories, feelings, food preferences, fears, musical preferences of their donor. One woman who got the heart of a boxer was the most quiet, demure, easygoing woman, hated violence, left the room when her husband would watch football. She got this heart of the boxer, now she watches football and yells and swears and punches and everything. So that's when I started hearing all these remarkable stories, and I started to collect every single one I could.
Could the transplanted heart be bringing with it some kind of information from its previous owner? We know that the heart is a hugely energetic organ and is in constant communication with the brain. 40,000 neurons, or nerve cells in the heart, communicate up to the brain. Hormones from the heart travel in our bloodstream, and every time the heart beats, it creates a pulse wave. But most impressive of all is our heart's magnetic energy, 5,000 times more powerful than the brain. It can be measured up to 6 feet away from our bodies.
I thought, this heart is just as powerful, more powerful, and does talk to the brain. Maybe we should be paying attention to that. Maybe the brain, even though it thinks it's us, isn't.
Professor Pearsall was sure that the energy of the heart and its relationship with the brain was the key. And as more and more transplant patients came up with these remarkable experiences, it seemed to confirm it. In the last 40 years, we have developed the ability to transplant a heart from one body to another. In that time, intriguing experiences have emerged from recipients who felt their personality had changed after their transplant. Professor Pearsall collated his research into a book called The Heart's Code. In it, he explored these stories about organ transplant patients and what they reveal about where we store our memories. Simultaneously, on the opposite side of America, Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry from Yale University, Gary Schwartz, was developing a new theory of how memory could work.
I was studying how feedback mechanisms are involved in learning. When we talk, for example, about how the brain learns, we talk about what are called neural networks in the brain. It turns out that the way a neural network works is that the output of the neurons feed back to the input of the neurons. And this process goes over and over again. And so long as the feedback is present, the neurons will learn. If you cut the feedback, there is no learning in the neurons. And the implication is that it's important for the neurons to have the feedback in order for the learning to take place. Well, by extension, any system that has feedback is going to therefore learn. I mean, we learn to shoot baskets, for example, in basketball by getting feedback about whether we're accurate or not. We learn to speak by getting feedback about whether we're accurate or not. And so consequently, any system, any set of cells that has feedback mechanisms in a network is going to learn the same way that neurons learn.
If we understand that death is a transformation and that life is eternal by its very nature because it takes place in a context of eternity, that all we experience are transformations and that there is a kind of evolutionary direction to this of growth towards the light, some traditions say. If we understand that, then the fear which kind of paralyzes and which limits us to such a great degree kind of lifts.